We also have from the Disabled Women's Network Canada, Bonnie Brayton, who's the National Executive Director. And from Women at the Centre, we've got Nika McGregor and Mandy Gray. And from the Avalon Sexual Assault Centre by video conference from Halifax, Nova Scotia, we have Jackie Stevens, who's the Executive Director. So I want to welcome all of our witnesses today. Each of you will be able to begin with your 5 minutes of comments, and we'll begin with Katarina for 5.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for inviting us to appear today. My name is Katarina. I'm here with Jeremy Dias, representing the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. So, as we reviewed this bill, we noted the following points, which we respectfully request that the committee consider. First off, we hope that in your deliberations, the members of the committee will consider the status not only cisgender women and men, but also transgender, intersex, genderqueer, gender fluid, and gender nonconforming individuals. For example, a sobering statistic is that of transgender individuals surveyed for the 2014 Trans Pulse survey, 20% have been assaulted physically or sexually for being trans. The committee's discussion of this bill has already included the issue of intersectionality and as well in gender-based violence and social context in judicial training, and we really agree that this is an important factor. Similarly, we hope that the committee will consider the status of those with diverse sexual orientation. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals report experiencing higher rates of sexual violence than heterosexual individuals. Furthermore, we request that the committee consider the impact that sexual assault proceedings may have on individuals of diverse gender identity and expression or sexual orientation. If members of the judiciary do not receive training covering that information, we feel that unintentional heteronormative, homophobic, or transphobic statements or actions towards the victim may mean that further stigma or indignity is attached to them unnecessarily. We also hope that you'll consider the ways that training education could be sensitive to these issues in what is already obviously a traumatic experience for the victim. We further hope that the committee will consider the changes proposed by Bill C-16, an act to amend the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. When this legislation passes, as we firmly hope and believe that it will, we feel that problematic interpretations of the law may still occur in sexual assault cases where gender identity or gender expression is a factor. We hope that with regards to judicial education and sexual assault law training, that the committee will consider that changes be reflected on an ongoing basis, and in the event that it does not pass into law, we hope that this content would still be included regardless, just because the people who are the reason for C-16 are not going anywhere, and if anything, they'll be fighting harder for equality in all ways and at all levels. We hope that in regards to the design and content of the training that judges will receive, that the committee will consider the positive impacts of guidance from leading members of the LGBTQ+ community who have experience in supporting victims of sexual assault, as well as those experienced in supporting individuals with intersectional identities and those from marginalized groups as well. We feel that this bill is really a human rights issue and that all individuals, no matter their gender or sexual orientation, need to be able to have faith that the judiciary is in tune, up to date, and sensitive to them and their needs. This is about making sure judges have better training. Then we hope that comprehensive education will mean exactly that and will encompass the issues and challenges faced by the LGBTQ+ community fully. Thank you.
Excellent. Now we'll go to Bonnie Brayton for 5 minutes. Welcome, Bonnie. No pressure.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, there was trouble with the taxi, and you've had me enter where you can't bring a taxi, so it wasn't accessible. Well, one Spark Street, you can't. You have to walk in.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Good to know. Great, you have 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the territory of the Algonquin people and that we are in a time of truth and reconciliation with the First Peoples of Canada at this time. I was invited to speak to the proposed Bill C-337. Could I have a glass of water? And I'm confident that others who will come before you will focus their remarks.
Madam Chair, can I make a suggestion here? Because of inaccessibility problems and the witness only just walked into the room, can I suggest we skip, if the witness wants, to another witness? It's only a 5-minute difference.
minutes to just collect myself, if you don't mind.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
We'll go then to Nika McGregor and Mandy Gray from Women at the Centre, and you have 5 minutes.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning, committee members. And that was very, very considerate. Thank you for my colleague, Bonnie. We thank you for the opportunity to make this submission on this very important bill. On behalf of Women's Centre for Social Justice, we're better known as Women at the Centre, myself, Nneka McGregor, and our Sexual Violence Response Coordinator, Mandy Gray, are here today as women survivors of gendered violence to speak to the need for an informed judiciary who receive continuous, comprehensive, and effective training on all aspects of violence against women, including sexual assaults. I'll begin by saying that I'm basing most of my comments off of a finding from a pilot initiative that Women at the Centre facilitated in 2014-2015, where we conducted a snapshot review of cases proceeding in several specialised domestic violence courts in Toronto, Ontario. As observations from the court watchers actually speaks directly to the issues being put forth in this bill. What the public knows are only those high-profile cases that makes the press, as with the rape trial presided over by Justice Robin Kemp. His egregious and ill-informed comments appear anomalous and occasional, but what we as women survivors know, as well as what we found from our court watch monitoring, is that those types of comments and attitudes are far more pervasive, forming part of the everyday misogyny in the courtrooms across the country. The only difference is that while other judges make similar comments and hold similar victim-blaming views, they are not being observed and oftentimes give no reasons for their decisions. No one is shining a spotlight on them, thus enabling them to continue treating victims in ways that skews the outcomes in favour of the offender with no regard for the victim. Too many members of the bench have attacked and viewed complainants in far too many sexual assault cases as though they are the wrongdoers. She's held accountable for her attacker's violence. It is like blaming a homeowner for a home invasion. Society simply doesn't do that. So why, therefore, are survivors being held to a different standard? The answer to this question is largely due to the fact that individuals who preside over these kinds of cases lack the education and training needed to understand the fundamental differentiators in sexual assault cases and how these cases need to be handled differently. Our Court Watch report documented so many instances where judges failed to hold perpetrators accountable even after they had pled guilty. Comments our Court Watchers documented are as egregious as those of Robin Kemp's, with only the difference being that we didn't name them, and that's something that we plan on doing in future Court Watch initiatives. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mandy Gray now. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Mandy Gray. I work for Women at the Centre. I'm also a PhD student, and I have also barely survived a rape trial myself. So it's important to note that Canada has amongst the most progressive affirmative consent laws in the world and privacy protections for complainants. The problem is that judges are struggling to apply the law. This is especially true when the sexual assault does not fit into the idealized archetype, the young, white, sober female victim violently attacked by a racialized male stranger in a public place. I'm going to focus on two major concerns that I've identified in Canadian courtrooms. It may assist in correcting some of the discriminatory attitudes. The first is the need for education on provisions in the criminal code that already exist, and the second is education on cases involving alcohol. There's a need for judicial education of Section 276 that refers to sexual history, and Section 278, the third-party records of the criminal code. These sections are colloquially referred to as rape shield laws. In theory, an application must be made to cross-examine a complainant about his or her previous sexual activity or access their third-party records, most often therapy records or other medical records. The judge's decision to enter either of these into evidence may have serious implication for the complainant, and it's imperative that the judge is making an educated decision. The third-party records application hearing, the complainant is actually entitled to legal representation paid for by legal aid. In contrast, the complainant is not entitled to representation at a sexual history application, and even if the complainant is willing to pay for representation, they are barred from attending. Since the courts have the power to enter the most private details into a public record, it is of utmost importance that the judge be aware of the very narrow grounds in which sexual history is even relevant to a sex assault trial. Of course, the judge must ensure that the accused has a right to a fair trial, but similarly cannot allow for a discriminatory defense. In theory, this seems like a simple task, but in practice has been proven to be difficult. Even when both applications are not made by counsel or are denied by trial judge, defense counsel pursue prohibited lines of questioning, anticipating that the Crown nor the judge will ever interfere. And even if they do, even if they are in violation, With proper education, judges can feel confident in their ruling and feel more confident in their decision making. And then it's also important to note that any education must include the role of alcohol. This risk is especially increased if she's attending post-secondary education, and many of these cases involve alcohol. There is no clearly defined threshold for intoxication in a sex assault case, which may be difficult for a judge with little expertise in the area and may partially explain why cases involving alcohol almost never result in conviction. There are significant resources being allocated to social campaigns about consent and alcohol, but these attitudes are not reflected in Canadian courtrooms. As it stands, alcohol is the perfect alibi in a sex assault case. There are two ways to change this, either by providing complainants with legal representation or by educating the courtroom actors to act in compliance with Canada's laws.
Very good. And now we'll go to Bonnie Brayton for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning again. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci.
Good morning and thank you.
Acknowledge the Algonquin people. I was invited to speak here to the proposed Bill C-337, and I'm confident that others who will come before you will focus their remarks on the content and the substance of that bill, which, as we know, is about the important need to have a judiciary that is well informed in the area of sexual assault. With limited time, we've instead chosen to focus on the Supreme Court decision that we believe makes it clear why judicial training is essential, and to suggest that a thorough review of the content of this training is required to ensure that it is fully developed curriculum to include a range of accommodation, the range of accommodation required to support all women. On February 10, 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada released its judgment in the case of R versus DAI. LEAF and the Disabled Women's Network of Canada intervened in that appeal. Through the Supreme Court decision of Canada decision, Chief Justice McLaughlin, writing for the majority, described the sexual assault as an evil and acknowledged that women with mental disabilities are targeted for this offense at alarming rates. The court confirmed the importance of hearing the voices of women with mental disabilities in the court. The court acknowledged that the testimony of women with mental disabilities is essential to stopping sexual abuse and ensuring that sexual offenders are brought to justice. The legal question before the court was how to interpret Section 16(3) of the Canadian Evidence Act, which permits witnesses who can communicate the evidence but are unable to understand an oath or affirmation to testify, unsworn, or a promise to tell the truth. Lower courts had developed a practice of requiring mentally disabled witnesses to explain the meaning of abstract concepts like promise, truth, and falsehood. No other category of witness, not even convicted perjurers, are subjected to such a pre-testimonial inquiry. The Supreme Court of Canada ruling clarifies that persons with mental disabilities are not required to meet a more onerous test than any other witnesses before they are even allowed to take the stand. If a witness can communicate her experiences, if she can describe what happened to her, she can testify after saying that she promises to tell the truth. The Supreme Court judgment noted in the past, mentally disabled victims of sexual offenses had frequently been precluded from testifying, not on the ground that they could not relate what happened, but on the ground that they lacked the capacity to articulate the abstract terms, the difference of between the truth and a lie. Women with intellectual and cognitive disabilities, including women with brain injuries, frequently acquired as a result of violence, experience staggering rates of sexual assault and are seen as easy targets. Abusers believe that disabled women are powerless to complain or will not be believed even if they do complain. The Supreme Court, in rendering this decision, acknowledged the reality and confirmed that their testimony is essential to any realistic prospect of prosecution. The fact that the Supreme Court majority recognized that the testimony of women with mental disabilities promotes the truth-seeking function of the criminal process, particularly given the undeniably high rates of sexual assault in the interest of society in the reporting and prosecution of abuse. As the Supreme Court itself said, excluding evidence would effectively immunize a category of offenders from criminal responsibility with devastating harm to the abused women and to society as a whole. The Supreme Court of Canada decision also notes that the questioning of mentally disabled adults may require accommodation of each individual's particular needs so that their evidence is best communicated in court. This aspect of this ruling is in step with international law and other international jurisdictions. The UK, for example, is currently far ahead of Canada in terms of providing for witness intermediaries who assist persons with communication or mental disabilities in accessing the justice system at all stages, from reporting to police to giving evidence in court. Creating and supporting a roster of witness intermediaries in Canada is a logical next step for the federal government. The decision is also consistent with Canada's international human rights commitments. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities points to the need for our country to uphold its promise under Article 13, where we are to have equal access to justice, and under Article 16, which commits state parties to ensure that instances of exploitation, violence, and abuse against persons with disabilities are identified, investigated, and, where appropriate, prosecuted. In Canada and around the world, this decision is regarded as a major victory for women and all people with disabilities and provides opportunities for appeals across jurisdictions around the globe. Thank you. Merci.
Very good. And now we will hear from Jackie Stevens, who's the Executive Director at the Avalon Sexual Assault Center. Jackie, can you hear us? You've got 5 minutes.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good morning. I am Jackie Stevens with the Avalon Sexual Assault Center, and want to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today from unceded Mi'kmaq territory here in Halifax. Avalon Sexual Assault Center is a feminist trauma-informed organization which provides services for those affected by sexualized violence. Avalon's primary emphasis is on support, education, counseling, and leadership and advocacy services for women and trans, non-gender binary people. Avalon offers sexual assault and abuse trauma-specific individual therapeutic counseling and group program services for women and trans and non-gender binary individuals aged 16 and older. We provide community education, public awareness, legal and professional training targeting the prevention of sexualized violence and intervention and support of victims and survivors. Avalon also operates the Avalon Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program, which provides immediate response to sexual assault victims of all ages and genders requiring medical care and the collection of forensic evidence. Avalon has expertise and experience directly serving individuals who have experienced sexualized violence and in advocating for an equality-focused community response to sexualized violence. We've engaged in legal advocacy and education on these issues in Nova Scotia since 1983. Avalon has expertise in substantive equality, sex, and gender-based discrimination and sexual assault law. And this presentation is intended to provide the Standing Committee on the Status of Women further points of analysis and consideration regarding Bill C-337. Avalon has a substantial interest in this bill and the work of the Standing Committee because of its importance to the development of sexual assault jurisprudence and the impact of this jurisprudence on women's substantive equality, including the women directly served by Avalon Center. Points that I would like you to consider as you review this bill include high-profile examples of systemic failure at all levels of the legal process has resulted in low rates of sexual assault reports and often results in victims deciding not to participate in or continue with the legal process after sexual assault or abuse has occurred. There is a level of distrust and lack of faith in the sexual assault criminal justice process, not only by victims, but within the general public. There is a perception that the rights of the accused are more important than the rights of victims, and that justice is not possible for victims of sexualized violence under the current justice process. The issues brought forth to the public as a result of many high-profile cases have increased the number of individuals who are going public with their experience before the courts and who are seeking systems and legal-based support and advocacy. Sexual assault advocates are not adequately resourced to provide ongoing court watch and court support, as well as address the need for reform and change, both at an individual victim level and societally and systemically. Criminal justice reform should continue to be based within the history of sexual assault law in Canada and in Parliament's intention to exclude discriminatory myths and stereotypes about women from judicial decision-making. Past and present judicial statements such as those by Judges McClung, Lenehan, and Camp demonstrate a disregard for women who have been targeted for sexualized violence. Their comments are rooted in misogyny, gender stereotypes, and sexual assault myths. Their decisions also demonstrate discrimination based on age, race, and perceptions of what is deemed appropriate behavior. What is critical to also note is that their decisions also demonstrate a lack of understanding of sexual assault and consent under the Criminal Code of Canada and/or blatant disregard for the laws. Reformative processes should reflect a gendered analysis of the experiences of sexual assault victims and survivors, both when victimized and before the courts. Sexual assault and abuse is committed from a position of power and control, and some victims are targeted because of gender, racial, or societal marginalization. Sexual assault laws under the criminal code are not gendered. However, how they are often administered and interpreted are almost always based on societal perceptions of gender, race, age, disability, etc. Many sexual assault cases are investigated, tried, and decided based from a perspective of looking at the victim's pattern of behavior and actions to determine consent or to refute that sexual assault occurred, rather than from the perspective of looking at the accused patterns of behavior that demonstrate predatory, intentional, or criminal actions. Reform should apply to all levels of court, not just Canadian Superior Courts, and should be reflective of all forms of sexual assault abuse under the law. Separate from Bill C-337, I would like the committee to consider what practices are in place to ensure that existing policies, laws, mandates pertaining to judges' training and decisions are being adhered to, and how can this committee influence or improve those current processes.
All right, and that's your time. Thanks so much. We're going to go now to Ms. DeMoss for 7 minutes of questions.
Well, I want to first thank all of you for being here, and I also want to apologize to you, Bonnie, for the issues that you had getting into the building. That's unacceptable, and I give you my word that we'll follow up with the building to ensure it doesn't happen to someone else who might be coming to committee. I want to, sorry, I'm trying to set my timer here so that I know how much time. I have 7 minutes. This is our second day of testimony on this bill, and I think everyone here agrees that when we hear about decisions like where in a case where it was said that a drunk is able to consent, or the comments that former Justice Camp made prior to the previous government actually appointing him to the federal court. Those kind of comments are simply unacceptable, and we need to do something to deal with it. The question becomes, how do we deal with that? Because both of those are currently sitting judges. And we as legislators don't have the ability to require education for them. What we do have the ability to do is provide resources for education, and so we did provide $2.7 million, and we had Justice Kent here at our last meeting who talked about how they will be having mandatory training for judges going forward. So that's a really good first step. We also had Ursula Hendel, who was here, talking about Crown prosecutors and the fact that there's absolutely no education for them. She's been a Crown prosecutor for 20 years, and it was 5 years in before she got her first training. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the need for training for Crown prosecutors, because especially with some of the groups that you're representing, who are some of the more marginalized in our communities, if you could just talk about the need for that, and if there's any role that the federal government could play for training for Crown prosecutors. So you can all comment on that if you wish.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. So just first and foremost, I do want to thank the committee again for having us, and we really appreciate being here. In terms of Crown prosecutors, one of the things we've noticed, and I'll just speak from my own personal experience, when I went to trial with my case, the Crown prosecutor indicated they didn't have enough time to even talk to me. And for me, that was the most heartbreaking part of the experience. I had to deal with the Ottawa police and the detectives, and they collected my testimony, and then even before I went to trial, it was pled out of court. So, I begged the Crown prosecutor to take 5 minutes and meet with me, but they indicated they were just too busy. And then after doing some research onto it, I found out that a lot of Crown prosecutors are just overworked, and there's just not enough resources for them to just do their job. So even before we talk about training for Crown prosecutors, I think it's really important that we recognize that the system is rather burdened, and they have high caseloads and high turnover, and the development of expertise is tough. I think that as we move forward, what the federal government needs to do is reach out to provincial governments and force that, as lawyers are trained provincially in the schools of education, that they definitely look at this being a mandatory part of training. A number of our staff and volunteers who have just finished their law degrees or are lawyers with our team have never even talked about LGBTQ issues, let alone disability or race or intersectionality. So the notion that you can go from kindergarten to the end of a law degree without talking about these really critical issues is shocking. And while I understand that this now becomes a provincial and territorial issue, I do think leadership from folks at your table have the power to reach out to ministers of education and say, look, this is a problem we're seeing at the federal level. How can you address it even before it can become a problem moving forward? So there's a long-term thing to address there, but also a short-term thing. I also do recognize that the training, and I'll be very brief because I know those other folks want to speak.
I don't have much time, so if you can wrap up so others can
really quick.
comment.
Just the last thing I want to mention is while we appreciate that there is some new funding going out to folks to provide training for judges, I do think that some of that money should be going to community organizations so that they're providing the training and that the training is done in collaboration. So as opposed to...
So, sorry, that you should be training the judges?
Yeah, so I mean, as opposed to the funding going to judges to train themselves and figure out who they need to train, I think the funding should go to community organizations so that we are the ones leading the training and that the training needs to be mandatory through community organizations. So if you want training on LGBTQ issues, you come to the Canadian Centre for, you know what I mean? A designated, I mean, the government does this with Xerox, right? I mean, if you guys want your paper photocopied, it's done with...
So I'm going to have to cut you off because I only have a couple of minutes left. So I'll just quickly if...
I just wanted to say quickly, my experience was a complete anomaly. The Crown had an excellent analysis of sex assault law. The judge was an expert in sexual assault, and I was absolutely brutalized through cross-examine because the Crown is terrified of objecting to problematic lines of questioning because it's so normalized in the courtroom. The case has now gone to appeal because the judge was too educated on sexual assault, and it looks like the conviction will be overturned. So I think it's largely about changing the norms of what is acceptable in the courtroom because it's become so normalized that even those actors that have this expertise and education, they're viewed as biased or are scared of acting, objecting to particular lines of questioning because they're worried about it being appealed at a higher court. And so even with the education, I think it's more so of changing the landscape of a sex assault trial as it currently stands.
And I think these discussions are important in changing that conversation as well. Bonnie?
I'm in fact going to Crown Prosecutor's Provincial Conference next week and giving a workshop on the DAI decision. So I certainly uphold the idea that this is a really important way that we're going to also see more convictions. There's no question that the Crown Prosecutor piece is extremely critical. I support what Jeremy said, is that, as you heard in my initial testimony, it's quite clear that there needs to be adjustments even to the judge training that exists. And I would say certainly that both for judges and for Crown Prosecutors that you need to involve the civil society organizations who have the expertise to provide that training. So.
I'm sorry, did you have anything to say, or I was going to move on to a next question?
To add 2 points if it's possible.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Just 2 points in relation to the question around training for Crown prosecutors. Here in Nova Scotia, the Crown's Public Prosecution Service of Nova Scotia is independent of the Department of Justice, and I know that that is unique in the country. So when it comes to mandating things like training and policies and such like that, it's a little bit of a different context. Whereas our Minister of Justice doesn't have any authority over the Crown's. The other thing, just in terms of worth noting, is that recently the Liberal government here in Nova Scotia has appointed 2 sexual assault crowns. So crowns who will specifically be, trained and specializing in the prosecution of sexual assault cases, which we hope certainly, will drastically change, what the climate has been here recently in Nova Scotia. So it's something.
Okay, that's your time. We're going to go then to Ms. Vecchio for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. And first, I want to correct the record. Ms. Damphoff had indicated that there was mandatory training. The mandatory training is for new judges, so it's not for judges that are currently there. So I just want to make sure the record notes that. I want to go on. We had some excellent expert witnesses here the other day, and I'm looking at the panel here, and a phenomenal panel, especially especially when we're looking at some of the issues. And we're talking about diversity. So some of the issues that we're looking at is diversity. And Dr. Elaine Craig stated that diversity on the bench is a huge issue that has the potential to improve a variety of aspects of the process. Regardless of the pool, we're talking about a very narrow demographic of very privileged individuals. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. We're talking a lot about putting money into judges and a variety of different things like that, but we have to recognize, and it's great to see the panel here today, we all walk different lives. And therefore, for someone to understand, we're talking about the group up here and trying to understand the group down here, which is not really going to happen. So I think it's really important that when we're looking at this training, that it has to be available. And I'm just trying to find out some thoughts on your where you're standing on this. You know, we're talking about people from the LGBTQ2 community. We're talking about people who are disabled. And I think it's really important that we recognize that those judges who are going to be sitting on the bench that have been either selected now or have been sitting on the bench for a number of years do need to have this training. What are some of your concerns with how we move forward with this? We talk about the mandatory training. We know the mandatory training is talking about everything, not just sexual assault. We want to specifically look at sexual assault. Can I get some comments on that, please? Jeremy, if you don't mind starting off.
Oh, I'll just pass it over to
Okay.
you to start. Yeah, I went first last time. Go ahead.
Okay, good.
Sure. So I think that you raise a very important point. I mean, certainly one of the things that we would like to see is more appointments of judges from diverse communities. That's a really critical way that we start to shift the conversation.
That's critical, but the problem is we have to recognize that the pool is not there.
Yes,
I
agree.
think that's one thing I just readily wanted to comment. That's why I think having the mandatory training is so important.
Yes.
We're talking about not the 1%ers perhaps, but we're talking about the people who have had privilege or have had the opportunity to get to where they are today. So carry on. Thank you.
So, you know, on that very basis, that's precisely why this mandatory training needs to be done. It's why we put such strong emphasis on making sure that the curriculum is properly developed so that it covers the full range of knowledge that they require to make the kind of decisions they're being charged with making and to oversee these cases. And I also think the point that was raised earlier around the fact that one of the sort of pay it forward things that we need to think about is, again, that recommendation to ministries of education around adjustments in curriculum. One of the ways that Dawn has tried to address this is by developing something we call learning briefs. And we've developed these learning briefs and share them with law schools, with gender studies programs, and a range of different post-secondary institutions around the idea that because the curriculum doesn't exist, it's important to take examples, for example, like the DAI case, and use them in the classroom as examples. I agree that doesn't address the problem you're talking about right now, and I think that the reason that this bill is so important is for precisely that reason, because we have to move from something that isn't mandatory to mandatory, including for those who are already in that place of privilege. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.
For us, it's really around who is delivering the training and the quality of the information that's coming forward. As women survivors, when we talk, we're talking from a place of lived experience, and we're talking about issues that, like Mandy spoke and Jeremy spoke about, the way that their trial impacted them and the lessons that you can learn as a result of going through that whole process. So for us, mandatory training is important, but who is delivering that training? You must include the voices of those individuals who've lived it, because it's our experience that's actually going to change the perception and the understanding.
Absolutely. Mandy? Yeah. No, wonderful.
I'll just add that, I mean, there's such a desperate need to diversify the pool at the very beginning. I think the lack of access to education for LGBTQ, especially trans and gender non-binary folk, remains a critical problem. I do think, you know, we need to look at, again, forcing provinces to subsidize or equalize access to education so that young people can climb up the ranks a little bit higher and reach into really cool opportunities. But I do think having leaders come out and be supportive and lifting other folks who are in marginalized positions up is also very critical. But the first step for that, of course, is creating that dialogue. So again, I just want to reiterate on the point that Pam was that opened the door for is if lawmakers, so, the Canadian Legal Aid Society, or if the law societies and the judges are training themselves, I think the challenge is that civil society is left out of the conversation, right? So step one is opening the door so we can engage with them and having that conversation. Step two is then having them create that space so that we can then apply for those jobs and apply for those opportunities and see ourselves in those opportunities.
Thank you so much. And Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you where you can finish the last question and start the new one. But we've heard the high-profile cases, but can you share with us some of those? We know that you have numerous cases, and I know even within the London area, I've spoken to the people from the Violence Against Women, where there's so many women that we're working with where the justice system has not been fair. So can you share from the last question, as well as some other situations that are not the high-profile, things that you have dealt with where you're seeing that the justice system is failing because of the non-understanding?
Thank you. Some of my points I think will touch on both questions. And I think, Nova Scotia, has had over the years some of the lowest reporting, charge, conviction and sentencing rates. And, certainly as we try to understand and make sense of that, some of that, we feel comes from, the history of how hidden sexualized violence has been in the province, and the lack of, until recently, comprehensive services across the province to address these issues with victims and survivors. There just simply hasn't been the resources or the specialized programs and services that can provide the supports that victims need, throughout the spectrum in terms of from the time that they disclose and then if they do choose to report right through the criminal justice process. But beyond that, Avalon Centre, 20 years ago started the first specialized trauma-specific sexual assault therapeutic counseling program. It was the only one of its kind, until very recently. The fact is that people have gone without access to services and supports, or there haven't been the resources to provide the advocacy and the long-term activism and action that people need at all levels. That's been crucial here in Nova Scotia.
And that's your time. Now we're going to Ms. Malcolmson for 7 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. This is extremely rich. All of the witness groups have given us lots of material that we can reflect in our final recommendations. And I also want to give you the assurance that on the NDP side, we're pushing for a true national action plan to end violence against women, which would bring that leadership to train police, to train education, to get consent culture all the way through the system, as other countries through the United Nations have done. So that push continues. But focusing in on this study, I'd love to hear from all 4 witness groups. If you can tell me, do you agree that in order to get the right training for judges, that you should have access to the curriculum to help design it and inform it? And secondly, have you ever been invited to do so in the past? Can I start with Dawn, and if you will work down and then finish with Avalon?
It's an excellent question, and yes, I absolutely think it's critical. Certainly one of the things that we know from 30 years of working at Dawn Canada is that we are still in virtually every arena finding that the basic understanding of accommodating women with disabilities and supporting women with disabilities has been a failure by the state at every level. And so to be really clear, the level of trust we would have in anyone except an organization like Dawn Canada being involved in developing that training is just not credible. In terms of the way that needs to be done, I think that it's important to understand, too, that many of the organizations that have this expertise have been really challenged and under-resourced for a very long period of time, and that the capacity to move forward with this kind of an initiative needs to be understood to be something that has to have a long view and a commitment to supporting the women's organizations and organizations for the people we represent, so that we can continue to do the work and not find ourselves challenged to the point where capacity to deliver this critical training is not possible. So I think that's an important point to note also. Thank you very much, Sheila.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective because people talk about specialized courts, specialization. And in the court watch that we conducted in 2014-2015, it was of the specialized domestic violence courts. And what we found overwhelmingly, that even though it was called specialized courts where you had specialized police, you had specialized crowns, you allegedly had specialized judges, the reality was that even with all the specialization, they still lacked the fundamental analysis of gender-based issues. So you'd have instances where somebody actually has the courage, goes forward, does disclose, and the police do investigate, and it gets to trial. What happens is that the judge then either gives this, no matter the charge, no matter the assault, what ends up happening is it's the same outcome. So everybody ends up with a peace bond. He walks away, and there's nothing that happens. So for me, when we talk about specialization, I come back to the issue of who is delivering the training, who is delivering the education to make you understand what actually happens in this context. And for us, to answer your question, have we ever been invited? No, we have not. I think it is critical, go back to Jeremy's point, that you cannot educate anybody on a subject matter without the experts. You need experts to do the educating. And you cannot have judges telling other judges about issues that they don't know anything about.
I'll just be really brief because I know Avalon has a lot to say on this. So just really quickly, I think this also speaks to the training that goes on for lawyers in our country. A number of lawyers, lawyers in our country have to do mandatory, I think, 30-something hours of training every year. And constantly lawyers are telling me that those training days are often slapped together where they take turns, jumping at the podium, talking to one another about their experiences. And I've been to these training days, and it's awful. It's just terrible. And the joke, of course, is that, I'll sit in the back and I'm not even invited to speak on LGBTQ issues. So we've never been consulted. No other LGBTQ organizations have been invited to the table to speak about these issues. And I think, we've had, parliamentarians, lawyers, and judges look at us and say, that button, that they, them button, I don't even know how to navigate that, let alone, go into the effects of someone being victimized as a trans or gender non-binary person on sexual assault. So, absolutely, I think civil society needs to play a critical role, and I do think the federal government could play a critical role in setting out the curriculum, which sounds like you're stepping on the provinces and territories, but you actually wouldn't be because you're setting out this legislation, and it wouldn't take a lot of work on your part to even raise the bar and say, and we're also setting the curriculum as well.
Thank you. Avalon.
I want to echo what the other presenters have said, is that, absolutely, experts from the community working, hands-on with these issues, and victims themselves need to be involved in the process of developing and delivering training to, all legal and law enforcement professionals, including judges. Avalon has worked with the Halifax Regional Police to develop police investigation and response training, and do deliver that on a regular basis. We have worked with the Nova Scotia Barristers Society to develop training for lawyers. But again, it is something that, if lawyers want to access that, they can, but it's not mandatory. So, again, one of the questions is it getting to the right people? Over the years, we have talked to judges and have advocated for training for judges here in Nova Scotia, have also worked in collaborations with organizations across the country, to advocate for training for judges, and we haven't been invited to do that. And often what we're hearing is that, again, judges would be not seen as being impartial, if they had specialized training. And I think, what all of us are trying to make the point is that it doesn't mean that you're no longer impartial. What it means is that you're informed, and that you actually have the specific knowledge and understanding of the issues of sexualized violence, as well as the intersectionalities of race and other oppressions, and how that impacts on victims and on the points of law. Because certainly, as many people that are on this panel before you now, and from what we know from high-profile cases across this country, is that people are being deliberately targeted for specific reasons, whether it's race, other forms of marginalization because of alcohol, because of misogyny, and then not only are they being targeted for victimization from those issues, but then those very issues of why they're victims is being held against them in court of law and is being used as a way to deny what has happened to them. And so that's what we need to get at in terms of those roots of how we're actually even understanding sexualized violence through training.
Very good. And now we're going to go to Ms. Vandenbeld for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all of the panelists. This is very, very compelling testimony, and again, apologize to Ms. Brayton for the difficulties in accessing the building. We've heard a lot in this committee about the fact that women of intersecting identities experience more violence, experience violence differently. What we're hearing here today is that they may very well be targeted because the judicial system doesn't recognize that. And I find it very alarming. I'm glad you referred to the Supreme Court decision, Ms. Brayton, about those losing their voice because of mental disabilities or not even being able to testify. I think that is quite alarming. And also, I think it was Ms. Gray who mentioned the stereotypes about what a victim looks like and what an aggressor looks like. So my question to you is, in the legislation that's being proposed here, it talks about training on evidentiary prohibitions, principles of consent, conduct of sexual assault proceedings, and myths and stereotypes. Now, in the training that our government is providing for the new judicial advisory committees who are going to be selecting new judges, we go beyond that. We have been training in unconscious bias, in diversity, intersectionality. Do you think that this legislation goes far enough? Is it too narrow? Should it be more explicit in talking about intersectional identities, talking about persons with disabilities or those without voice, talking about LGBTQ, non-binary? Do you think that we need to include more of that in this legislation? And I'll just go across in the same order.
So I think it doesn't go far enough. I think the explicit needs to be there. We've reached out to judges and lawyers and law firms and been like, hey, we need to do this training. And they're like, oh, we had our unconscious bias training, or we've had our diversity training. And, then we'll get a copy of what they did. And, LGBTQ was 3 minutes. And it's just... it's just not comprehensive. So, I mean, the funny thing is there are people who want to learn. They have mandated time that they have to spend every year to learn, and yet they're not connecting with civil society. I think the other piece that I really want to mention, and I can't speak for the other witnesses, but I do encourage them to speak out if this is their reality as well. We don't have any funding from Victim Services Canada to then, if I'm doing this reach out to lawyers or law firms or judges, it's on the side of my desk. And, we would love to tap into this funding that is going out to these law societies and law organizations that already have tons of funding to do this work. And we would love that funding so that we can do that work. Avalon is in my experience, an exception. I've seen their work in Nova Scotia. Incredible work working with the judicial system, and I'm constantly in awe with them. I think they're some of the coolest groups. But again, none of us are funded to do this work. And so the progress that some of us have been able to make has been minimal and limited. And I just wonder if we're able, if you're doing this, if we're funded to do that, then that would make it a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to note, for example, I went and did a talk at a law school, and I asked the students, had they ever had a non-lawyer present? I was the first one. They were third-year law students. And I think it's also important to note, too, that as survivors, we are often asked as individuals to come and provide our expertise as to divulge the most vulnerable moments of our lives for no compensation. I don't work until last week. I started working officially with Women at the Center, but up until then, it was a request to divulge all this information with no compensation or recognition. Just how sensitive the issue is, especially when you are delivering training to people that don't have knowledge of the topics. So, of course, I think there needs to be a broader spectrum of training and education. What exactly that will look like, I think that will be really difficult to decide, and how much that actually, what it looks like in practice, I think will be interesting.
I'm really glad you asked the question, and I think the fact that I brought up this Supreme Court decision speaks to the reality that we had to intervene at that level in order for this issue to even come forward before the judiciary because of what had happened at the provincial court level with this particular decision. And the reality is that women with disabilities are not believed. Many women are not believed. I think that the whole issue of women's credibility in testifying is critical. The struggle for any woman to come forward and report is huge. You can imagine for a woman with a disability, if she's not supported, the kind of challenges she's faced just to get to that court. So the idea that she gets to the court and then her credibility is questioned is huge. And so, in terms of the reality that we must include civil society and really focus on the training piece is absolutely critical, that it be intersectional, that this isn't going far enough is absolutely clear. The idea that Supreme Court decisions like this ones have been obtained by John in 2012 and that most of the judiciary and Crown prosecutors are not aware of this is so critical. And it makes really strongly the point. That was in 2012. It's 2017. In December of 2016, I heard from a woman whose daughter had been sexually assaulted. She was had a learning disability, was in high school, and was being told by the Crown prosecutor, you shouldn't go forward with this. You don't really want to go through this. Being discouraged from going forward when she had reported a 13-year-old girl sexually assaulted at her break in school. So yes, I think it's extremely critical. Women with disabilities are being sexually assaulted at least twice the rate of other women, and we are not being supported to come forward and testify. And again, coming to the point that all the other folks have made and that we've reiterated here, it's critical to understand that to support that. Nobody supported Dawn going to the Supreme Court except LEAF. There was no funding. There was just enough funding to get us to the table. And to understand that for Dawn Canada to even exist 30 years in, and that we're the only organization for women with disabilities, speaks to the huge gap in understanding of who needs to be supported at the civil society level and all the way up. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens.
Again, these are very important points that are being made, and I really urge the committee to be considering them in all seriousness in terms of, across the board, how this impacts, this decision around this bill and other areas that address this issue. Picking up on some of the other presenters, I think that training is crucial. It does need to be intersectional. It needs to be done at all levels, and it needs to be done more than once a year or as continuing education. It needs to be done throughout, sort of that there's like a full spectrum of issues that are being addressed, as well as the ways in which training is delivered. And that, again, it's crucial that experts from the community, from the areas of focus of that training, are involved. And I agree with others in terms of that there does need to be compensation, because most of us are doing this work, as part of our mandate, so there's funding in that sense. But when you're talking about this kind of specialized training that is ongoing, that is multifaceted, and that is looking at not only at first response and direct service delivery, but is also looking at best practices, legislative change. All of that does take time and energy and resources and specialized knowledge, and so that needs to be recognized, and definitely this training needs to be done in collaboration. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks so much. We've had a request to have our committee take 15 minutes at the end of the meeting and go in camera. And so I'm going to switch up to our second panel, and I want to thank all of the witnesses that have testified today and appreciate your experience and your courage in continuing to bring awareness to this issue. Thank you.
Quick
Mr. Fraser?
point of order, I guess. Maybe it's just a question. Some of the witnesses gave incredible testimony. If they're available and are able to stick around for the second half to take questions so we can get further testimony on the record, if possible, is that acceptable?
I believe that's allowable.
To the availability of the witnesses, of course.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Thank you. So we'll change up the panel, and we'll suspend briefly while we do that. Yeah, there's none of the I would call a vote then on the request to have 15 minutes of in-camera
Can
at
I
the
just
end
say
of the
something
committee.
to it? Because
Sure.
someone has just called me rude. I wouldn't be asking to go in camera if I didn't think it was important, and I think we decided to jam-pack these meetings with an awful lot of witnesses, which is challenging to begin with, but I am very respectful of the witnesses and the witnesses' time. I'm going to leave it at that because certainly the opposition has done things that have required us to actually leave meetings. So I'm always respectful of our witnesses, and I appreciate you having the opportunity for me to say that.
Ms. Vecchio.
I respect where we're coming from. I'm just wondering if 15 minutes is a lengthy time as well. Is there something that it's really going to be a 2 to 3 minute discussion, or is there something that is so critical because we are doing so well on the testimony today?
I don't know. So I think 15 minutes would be appropriate.
Further discussion on the motion. Ms. Malcolmson.
Well, I'll say again, without having any notice or any idea what the content is about, and often we do talk about things this one-on-one, I'm also opposed. We've invited witnesses here, and then we have to go to question period at 11. It's an unusual day, so I'm planning to vote no.
Further discussion? All right, on the motion to go in camera for 15 minutes at the end of session, all in favor? All opposed? And carried. And with that, I would like to welcome from the Native Women's Association of Canada, we have Chad Kixnaway and Francine Joe. And from the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia by video conference, we have Tracy Porteous. From the Women's Shelter Canada, we have Lise Martin. And from Regroupement Québécois des Centres d'Aide et de lutte contre les agressions à caractère sexuel, we have Marlehan Lopez, who's the liaison officer. So welcome to all of you, and each of the speakers will have 5 minutes to bring their comments, and we'll begin with Francine.
Good morning, Madam Chairperson, wide committee members, guests, and distinguished witnesses. My name is Francine Joe, and I am the interim president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. I would like to first acknowledge that we are on Algonquin territory, and we are meeting here today on this beautiful spring day. I'm honored to have worked alongside Ms. Martin of the Women's Shelter Canada on the 16 Days of Activism to End Violence Against Women campaign, and I thank all of today's witnesses for their commitment to supporting the empowerment of women and advocating for policies that address the roots of violence against women. I'm here today with Mr. Chad Kixnaway, NWAC's Senior Advisor on Justice and Human Rights. We thank you for the opportunity to present to you today on such an important subject. As a woman of First Nations descent and the national representative of First Nations and Métis women, it is my primary goal to advocate for policies that improve our well-being. This includes social, economic, cultural, and political spheres. The issue of violence against women extends into each of these areas. I believe that the reported rate of 1 in 3 women living in Canada experiencing sexual assault in their lifetimes is a low estimate when low reporting rates are taken into account. For Indigenous women, the rate is at least 3 times higher. The launch of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls marks the official recognition that violence against our women has reached pandemic proportions. Indigenous women face multiple barriers to receiving justice after being assaulted. The first is the fear of coming forward. This may be a fear of retaliation, but it is commonly a fear of not being heard or believed. There is no question that general practice of victim blaming stops many women from coming forward. Indigenous women face not only the sexist aspects of the system, but the practice of racism as well. It is well documented that Indigenous women have been questioned aggressively, unfairly judged, humiliated, and even assaulted while reporting their assaults and even while in custody. While it may no longer be the practice of the media to criticize a woman for her lifestyle when reporting on cases of sexual assault, the decisions and comments made by judiciary officials have continued to perpetuate racism and sexism that contribute to the propagation of violence against Indigenous women. In the case of Cindy Gladue, a judge allowed graphic genital photos of the victim and a physical sample from the body to be shown in court. The fact that she was a sex worker was given undue bearing on the proceedings. The court's prejudice had an impact on the jury's judgment on consent and led to the ultimate acquittal of the man who killed her. Such errors in judgment, colored by ignorance, bias, and outright racism, send Indigenous women and perpetrators of violence against Indigenous women a message that Indigenous women's lives are not valued. Indigenous women need to be shown that they are loved and that they are valued. Our justice system needs to address this by passing bills which will strongly discourage light sentencing against perpetrators of violence against Indigenous women, consider being an Indigenous woman as an aggravating factor when sentencing an offender, and address the systemic racism and sexism that keeps Indigenous women silent, which encourages a perception that they are vulnerable. This bill comes at a pivotal time in Canada's history as we move toward reconciling with the first inhabitants of this country, the Indigenous population. The passing of Bill C-337 would send a clear message that the justice system refuses to play a role in further violence against Indigenous women and that Indigenous women are respected, loved, and valued. We thank you for this invitation to offer our input on the specifics of this bill and its implementations. Therefore, on behalf of Native Women's Association, I'm pleased to state our support for this bill and elaborate on our recommendations and concerns. The proposed addition to the Judges Act to make it mandatory for newly appointed judges to complete comprehensive education in sexual law is a positive move forward. It must be expected that NWAC would bring forth a recommendation that this comprehensive education include a distinct section or course or chapter that discusses Indigenous women exclusively. NWAC has done extensive work in this area already, and we are ready to offer our continued expertise on this matter. This could take form in developing a comprehensive educational toolkit that brings awareness to unique issues that Indigenous women experience. My first recommendation for the committee to consider is incorporating into Section 2.2 of the bill a reference that specifically addresses violence against Indigenous women. The tail end of the proposed amendment of Section 3B of the Judges Act would read, as well as education regarding myths and stereotypes associated with sexual assault complainants, and education regarding the unique experiences of sexual violence against Indigenous women. I believe this inclusion will add value to the reconciliation process between Canada and the first inhabitants of this country. A shortcoming of the bill that may have been brought to your attention, it appears that the bill's requirements of the comprehensive education in sexual assault law would only apply to newly appointed judges. Section 2.2 of the proposed bill is clear that candidates in consideration of judicial appointment need to undertake education in instruction in evidentiary prohibitions, principles of consent, and the conduct of sexual assault proceedings, and education regarding myths and stereotypes associated with sexual assault complainants.
Thank you. I'm sorry. That's your time. Okay. We're going to go now to Tracy Porteus, who's the Executive Director at Ending Violence Association of British Columbia. Go ahead, Tracy. You've got 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'm speaking here from the beautiful Coast Salish territory. I'm in Vancouver. I'm speaking on behalf of the Ending Violence Association of BC, which is a provincial body that has 240 programs across the province that respond to sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. I'm also speaking on behalf of the Ending Violence Association of Canada, which is a new national organization that is in place to respond to gender-based violence in practical ways, like the development of policy, training, and intervention strategies. I want to thank the committee for having me here today, and I would like to express our support of this bill, which addresses something that is at a crisis point in our country. We've never seen such a low in terms of public confidence in the justice system, and when it comes to sexual assault, I think the low is at an all-time low. I think that many survivors of sexual assault don't come forward to report because of the news reports they've been hearing, but that has been the case for many years. Stats Canada suggests that only 5% of sexual assault survivors report to the police. However, we believe it's far lower. There are some researchers out of SFU here in Vancouver that say that the number of women who report sexual assault to the police is so low it's considered statistically insignificant. Yet sexual assault is far from insignificant. The results of sexual assault can be a debilitating psychological impact that lasts an entire lifetime for survivors. And I think it is incumbent upon the justice system to get it right. We also know from those who work with sex offenders that many sex offenders, this is not just usually a one-time occurrence. In fact, most sex offenders, by researcher standards, have somewhere between 400 and 1,000 victims in their lifetime. And so when we have one survivor, 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 that comes forward seeking a remedy from the justice system, it is incumbent upon us to get it right. And unfortunately, we are failing survivors so badly and have been for so many years. And so we thank you. We thank the committee. We thank the House of Commons. We thank the Leader of the Opposition for bringing this issue forward in the way that you are today. We think specifically in terms of training for judges, it's important that judges have training to understand the neurobiology of trauma and of fear that so many women have during a sexual assault. I think this is one of the most misunderstood aspects. Sexual assault is unlike any other crime. It is considered one of the most violent crimes a person can experience, and it's considered on par with what a soldier that might experience PTSD in a war-torn country who has seen horrible things or whose life has been in danger for her or himself. And so I think that we need to have police and the judicial folks understand how the trauma of sexual assault manifests in a human being, what happens in the moment of trauma, and what happens that manifests different kinds of actions on the part of survivors. We have seen too many cases where police or the judicial system has really just been misunderstood. In many respects, we are asking people who have very important jobs in our country to do those jobs blindly without any training. So sexual assault being as complicated as it is, and the dynamics of sexual assault and the fear that is produced in a sexual assault, we also need to understand how that can be replicated in and of itself in a courtroom. Most sexual assaults are perpetrated by males upon females. The issue is about power and control. And unless a judge in their courtroom is completely conscious of that, those same power dynamics can be replicated in a courtroom. They can be replicated in an interview room if somebody reports to police. So in addition to the necessary training of the judiciary, we also think the bill would be strengthened by including training for the RCMP. We understand that the aspects of the bill are written in such a way as to try to expedite its assent, but we also think that a house, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And if I think about a house and we want to insulate the house and we have 1 or 2 windows wide open all winter long, that's the way I see our justice system. We have many police jurisdictions that are availing themselves of trauma training. To some extent, here and there, Crown, anti-violence services and sexual assault services have definitely been availing themselves of the best training possible. But if we don't have training at the top of the food chain, if you will, at the judges, or even at the police, we're doing an extreme disservice. The other thing that's important to understand—
I'm sorry, that's your time. I'm very sorry. We're going now to Lise Martin for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share our thoughts on Bill C-337. Women's Shelters Canada, formerly known as the Canadian Network of Women's Shelters and Transition Houses, brings together 14 provincial and territorial shelter organizations representing over 400 shelters across Canada. We believe that the introduction, and more importantly, the implementation of Bill C-337 is an important step in the right direction, and we congratulate all MPs who are working across party lines to make this a reality. Following the numerous testimonies that you have heard over the last 18 months as members of this committee, I do not need to convince you that the systems intended to respond to violence against women are broken. Recent court decisions in Alberta and Nova Scotia involving sexual assault and domestic violence have spurred public outrage. Clearly, Judge Lenihan and former Justice Kemp demonstrated a clear disregard for and the lack of understanding of sexual assault and definitions of consent as defined in the Criminal Code. In November 2016, Judge Deborah Paquette of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador downplayed the severity of strangulation in a domestic violence case, treated the perpetrator as the victim, categorized domestic violence as a private matter and sentenced the RCMP officer to only 14 days house arrest for assaulting his former girlfriend. This in November 2016. These recent examples, which are by no means exceptions, demonstrate how Canadian courts are failing to send the message that sexual assault and all forms of violence against women are unacceptable. For decades, advocates in the violence against women sector and survivors have fought to make domestic violence and sexual assault visible and a socially significant issue. Despite this, we continue to see our work undermined by Canadian judges who label domestic violence as a private matter and misunderstand the basic ideas and laws about consent and sexual assault. Enacting Bill C-337 to ensure training for judges working on cases of sexual assault is a demonstration of the Government of Canada's commitment to ensure that our legal system believes survivors. Training, however, must go beyond federal judges. Police, lawyers, Crown prosecutors, and judges all need training on sexual assault and domestic violence. For victims of sexual assault, police officers are their first interaction with the justice system. Since fear is the main barrier to victims reporting sexual assault and domestic violence, we need systems that support victims and does not cause them further harm. Our understanding of the proposed bill is that it only covers federally mandated judge. This is an example of why we need a national action plan on violence against women. A national plan could cover judges mandated by the provinces and territories and begin to ensure that women in all areas of the country have access to comparable levels of services and protection. This is not the case today, and this is an area where federal leadership is called for. In conclusion, mandatory and ongoing education, which includes the neurobiological impacts of trauma, the power and control dynamics of violence against women, the role of intersectionality, as well as the experiences of survivors with input and participation of women's organizations would go a long way. At Women's Shelters Canada, we would like to see training for judges broadened to include not only training on sexual assault, but also training on domestic violence and the gendered nature of violence against women, training to better understand colonization and intergenerational trauma with a focus on their impact upon Canada's Indigenous peoples, training for the judicial committees that oversee the appointment of judges, collaboration with women's organizations in developing training, including trauma-informed approaches, and finally, training that is shaped by the perspective of survivors as they are indeed the true experts. Finished.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, nous continuons avec...
So we will continue with Marlene Lopez. You have 5 minutes, please. Good morning. I'd like to thank you for giving us this opportunity to testify on such an important problem this morning. Through surveys that our organization has conducted, we have realized that many women feel that the treatment they've received after reporting a crime in the Canadian legal system is deficient, unfair, and full of prejudice. So we feel that the training of judges and future judges on sexual assault is essential so that we can do away with the stereotyping that is current in decision-making and in the Canadian legal system. We have to overcome systemic obstacles and have better access to justice. The Regroupement Québécois des Centres d'aide et de lutte feel that we need to have better knowledge of the sexual assault problem and better understand the vulnerability and the isolation, the perception that the aggressors towards marginalized society, all this tied in with sexual assault. Training of judges should lead to a fight against the missuccess in our society and in our institutions, and how other systems of oppression, such as racism and sexism, or in other types of discrimination, is often seen in people in the LGBTQ community. We have to look at all of this in the context of sexual assault. The training should also enable us to understand the barriers to the legal system, which make it very difficult for certain victims to have access. They feel very vulnerable, and they're discriminated against throughout the legal process, and this is a barrier to justice. The training should also deal with the definition of sexual assault and the evolution of this definition to include other forms of sexual violence, which meets our reality. The training should also be tied into other forms of violence such as racism, transphobia, and other types of behaviors that we see. Prejudice must also be dealt with. We must analyze how some groups are particularly stigmatized, depending on, and this would include socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, immigrant status, etc. The consequences of discrimination with respect to victims and their needs and rights must also be dealt with. Some impact can be found amongst all victims, whereas some impacts can be found more specifically in other groups. For example, a precarious immigrant may be worried about being able to remain in the country. Hate victimization can also be a factor that comes into play. And victims who are disabled can be refused services if their assaulter, if the person who does the assault provides them with health services. So judges must be sensitive to these realities in order to really understand the consequences that victims have to deal with. We have to look at the special needs of victims, particularly women who are particularly vulnerable, to ensure that we have equal access to justice. These needs include implementing accommodation measures, and access to certain means, such as testifying outside the courtroom and in-camera testimony, to make it easier for victims to testify when they are recounting their situation, particularly when we're dealing with vulnerable women who may have a precarious immigrant status. The training should also include behaviors that need to be avoided to avoid further victimization and to make sure that these decisions are not discriminatory. Often we are biased about people who have certain sexual persuasions or certain classes. We need to sometimes racial factors are taken into account in decisions. The ethnic origin and racial origins of the victim are often used as factors in the decision-making process. I'm sorry, but your time has expired.
To Ms. Ludwig for some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of your testimonies and helping us become more informed on this issue. The bill before us is an important, the spirit of it is an important one that we definitely want to get right. And we've heard from a variety of witnesses today and actually today in our last session on the scope of the bill and some areas where it may need to be broadened. As the bill stands right now, in terms of instilling public confidence and faith in the system, if mandatory training on sexual assault was there as put forward, I'm wondering if it would instill faith in the system, or maybe even a blind faith in the system. And I just want to open this up to your experiences and opportunities on this, because we've heard from testimony, for example, looking at the crime funnel. A sexual assault takes place. Most victims are fearful of actually reporting. Then they go before the police. This bill does not take in that element of it. Then in terms of the court system itself, many cases are pleaded out. Those that are going to court, we've heard testimony about the concerns around the lack of training and awareness in the system for Crown prosecutors as well as the defense attorneys. At that point, there still could be another plea. And then we're looking at juries and we're looking at judges. If we limit the scope of this bill as it stands right now, to just training judges, is that going to give enough faith in the system? Because are people going to be assuming that the whole system comprehensively received mandatory training?
Oh, well, my sense is that those in the legal system might think that it's sufficient, but definitely those affected firsthand will not, as will the organizations and the advocates that work directly with survivors of sexual assault and violence against women generally.
And Tracy has a comment.
Oh, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. I think that one way to make this particular bill stronger is to make sure that it not only mandatorily trains new judges coming onto the bench, but mandatorily trains all federal judges. I think the wording right now is that it's new judges and it should be all judges. I also think that we shouldn't limit ourselves to creating reforms just in relation to judges training. If including training for police doesn't work for this bill, then let's have another bill in terms of ensuring that training for RCMP be done. I also think that there's many legal minds that are contemplating changes to the criminal code. Right now, the way the criminal code is worded is that there's a requirement on Crown to prove that consent did not take place. It's very hard to prove that something didn't take place. So I was at a conference recently where a number of legal minds were saying that perhaps we need to change or codify the rules in the criminal code around consent so that it's up to defense to prove that consent was in fact there. It's almost a reverse onus. So I think that there's a number of things we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about provincial court judges. I know that's not your jurisdiction. But I'll just say this one last thing. In the 1980s, there was a letter that was sent by the Federal Attorney General to all the attorneys general in the country saying, please do more about spouse assault because, women are being beaten by their husbands in their homes, and it's another form of silent violence that's going on across the country. And after that happened, every attorney general in every province and territory in the country developed policies and programs and responses in relation to spouse assault. Now, of course, we're not there yet, but I think that those of you who are at Canada's House in Ottawa, don't underestimate the power that you have in influencing your provincial and territorial counterparts, because I think when we all work together, we'll more likely be able to advance. So don't think about this particular bill as the only thing that's needed. I think we need to be working on a lot of fronts.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And if I could just add to this as well, certainly we've heard that from a variety of witnesses, that it's not a one-stop shop in terms of the mandatory training. And also, I guess my point for asking the question is, unless we start working on, the aspect of the crime funnel, mandatory judge training, the judge could be the best trained judge out there, but unless the system itself has some correction factor, he or she, as a judge before the court or on the bench, only has the evidence before him or her to make that judgment on. They may be the best informed on sexual assault, but certainly what we've heard from the last 18 months of testimony looking at violence against women and young girls, we need to have a comprehensive approach to dealing and supporting those that are survivors of sexual assault.
I think Chad had a comment. I don't know if you're interested to hear.
And any other comments on that? Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to add that, the current Judges Act, Section 62, does grant council powers to establish ongoing seminars for existing judiciary. But my concern here is that the bill only impacts newly appointed judges. I would suggest incorporating into the current bill, Bill C-333, some sort of transitionary provision or some sort of other provision that compels the council to actually enact make it a priority that all judges, all of them, even the new ones and the old ones, to take the mandatory comprehensive education sexual assault.
Thank you for raising that, because when Justice Kent and Mr. Sabram were in and they were talking about the training itself, if it's just training for new judges, they may not see another sexual assault case for 5 or 6 years. And it would be outdated, they may not remember, or they may never see a sexual assault case. So certainly one of the recommendations that we have heard is ongoing training within the judicial system and in other areas. And I'm just going to pass my time over, unless you want to say something, Francine? Or
you're out of time, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
All righty. And then we'll go to, is it Miss Vecchio or Miss Harder? Miss Harder would like 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that the National Judicial Institute said is just how important it is to consult with wider society when forming the training that goes out to judges or that they participate in. And so they said that they want to do that, or that they are doing that. But I guess, when Ms. Ambrose was consulted on this bill or brought in as a witness, she also said that she hoped that the Liberal government would put this as a priority and that funding would be put toward consulting groups such as yourself in order to make sure that the training was spoken to by, I would say, the experts or those who are on the ground working with these individuals day in and day out, which of course is very important for this training to actually be as effective as possible. That said, I would be curious to know as to whether or not any of you have been consulted with regards to the new judges training. We'll start with Lise.
No, I haven't. And I think on this issue, it's a question of bringing together the theory and the practice. And it's not, I don't think it's one or the other. It's really needing to bring them together and to see how they work or not work. And that needs to be incorporated into the training.
Chad, has your organization ever been consulted?
No, it hasn't.
Francine? Lise? Or, sorry, Tracy. Sorry, I apologize.
That's okay. I would say that my feeling is that the National Judicial Institute is starting to open up. I've been working in this field for 35 years, and just last year was invited to do a one-off workshop for a group of provincial court judges at a national judges conference on domestic violence and homicide. But the issue is embedding systemic change. I think the judges would say that, there is a course on sexual assault for new judges, or there is some training that happens at national conferences, but mandatory embedded training where, and as it's been said by others, it shouldn't happen in a silo. I think the judiciary and the National Training Institute for Judges should be working with those of us that have some expertise, that have been providing training across sector, to ensure that the training that's going forward is founded from a perspective of women's and survivors' experience of sexual assault and is founded from a trauma-informed perspective. I don't think that they should be working sort of in silos any longer.
Thank you. And Ms. Lopez, has your organization ever been consulted?
No. And I agree with what Tracy's saying. It's very important that with these types of initiatives, the groups that are on the ground that have the expertise are consulted, because I see it time over again and again, the groups aren't consulted, and then these projects are pushed forward and they don't address the realities that victims, survivors face in sexual assault.
Thank you very much. Now, again, this is a question for each of you, and that is, of course, you talk within your various networks to other organizations. Are you hearing overall support for this bill? Are there other organizations that you're talking to that would say, yes, we're in support of this bill going forward? I'd like to start with Tracy on this one.
Yes. So across the board, I have not spoken to anybody who isn't in support of the bill. Many people like myself would like to see, some changes to the bill in terms of training for all federal judges, not just the new ones. We would also like to see a mechanism for provincial court training and police and so forth, everything I've already said. But I would say unanimously, the 240 programs under our umbrella and the national association that I'm the co-chair of, they have endorsed the bill unanimously.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tracy. Ms. Lopez.
Yeah, there's general support for the bill among groups that work with sexual assault victims, but we're also fearful that the bill, if it's passed, it will be seen like a panacea to in confronting the systemic barriers that do exist for victims and survivors when accessing the criminal justice system. And also we're fearful that it will just be an initiative that will be imposed on the judges, newly appointed judges. I think it's important that all judges be pushed to have this training, and I think it's very important for it also to be that we address the fact that it's not only the judges that need to be trained, but police officers, even people who offer services, health services. So I think it should not be only, we shouldn't concentrate all efforts only just on judges, and that's something that's really important for people who work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Lopez. Francine.
Yes. Speaking with some of my friends, my colleagues in British Columbia, we felt that this type of training had been offered earlier would have probably been more supportive of the inquiry, where women would have felt more confident in the system to report their cases. But as my colleagues are pointing out, this is a type of training that needs to be incorporated in the whole process. Personally, I've gone with a friend to a center, and when she wanted to go through the process, it's very daunting. And so then you don't have a reporting of an incident.
I totally understand that. I think this is a good first step. I think we have to start with the judiciary, and of course it doesn't stop there. We definitely need an overhaul of the whole system. We only have a few seconds left here, so Chad, Lise, what are you hearing,
Lise.
Either of you?
Definitely support, but I think it would be a missed opportunity to just zone in on sexual assault, training on sexual assault, and it should be on the whole continuum of violence against women and gender-based violence.
Sure, I would agree to that. Chad?
Again, I just want to re-articulate, including a distinct chapter or course or component that deals with Indigenous women.
Are you hearing organizations
I'm sorry,
are in
that's
support
your
of this,
time.
though?
We're going now to Ms. Malcolmson for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll just say to all the witnesses, as I did to the first panel, that this big picture comprehensive approach is exactly what Canada committed to the United Nations when it said that it would adopt a national action plan to end violence against women, and that would take that leadership to intersect training of judges, of police officers, whether it's municipal, territorial, provincial. We're very sorry that the Conservatives didn't fulfill that commitment when they were in power, and the Liberal government is also saying that they won't. And DP keeps pushing it and saying this is the solution. So I do appreciate that this is a private member's bill that's only able to take one narrow slice, but it's because we haven't had implementation of Canada's 20 years ago UN commitment so far. That said, I want to turn to Native Women's Association. Thank you for raising again the terrible story of Cindy Gladue in Alberta, because we haven't said her name in this committee review yet. And ask you just to expand a little bit more on how training for judges could be created in a way that's sensitive to the cultural and the different lived experiences of Indigenous women. And maybe a second part of that question is, would it be helpful for groups like NWAC? Actually, I think you said this maybe in response to my Conservative colleague, but if anything you want to add about the imperative to review and shape the content so that judges really are delivering their judgments in a culturally sensitive way.
I'll say a little bit here and then I'll pass it to Chad, but I think what we need to see is that this training, as Ms. Martin mentioned, needs to incorporate the history also that affects Indigenous women there. You know, we've had the cases or the history from residential schools and the traumas that are affecting women, and they're affecting the perspective of Canadian society towards Indigenous women, so that we unfortunately don't have Indigenous women feeling respected or valued. So this type of training can start to open up the eyes of Canadian society and the judicial system. But I'll pass it to Chad, who will talk more about what we see this looking like.
This training should also incorporate everything that Francine has said, but also incorporate or unpacking and unfolding the systemic injustices within the criminal justice system that impact a lot of Aboriginal offenders and victims as well. It's not just the judges, but also the Crowns and Defense Counsel that kind of devalue or see less value in an Indigenous person when they're in the criminal justice system. So I think that's important for the entire judiciary to understand that they're not less productive or have nowhere else to go, but they're also an equal citizen in Canada. So I think that needs to be attached as well to any type of education, comprehensive education package.
Thanks. Turning to Lise Martin, can you tell us more about the on-the-ground outcomes that you've seen? That what's the collateral damage to women who have come forward who then don't see their concerns and don't feel fairly treated by the justice system? Can you just illustrate that a little bit more about what's the damage of not improving the system and not giving victims and survivors a better day in court?
You know, and I think it's often a case of also daily occurrences of bad decisions that just build on one another and make it difficult for women to move out of this life of violence that they are living, essentially. And you know, one example would be a family court example here, in terms of a judge basically providing time for his preschool children, so very young children, and the time for contact with the dad was via Skype, but at 9 o'clock to accommodate his schedule. So that's the type of you know, very daily occurrences, but that have an impact on the bigger picture. And I think that's where this training just has to have so many levels, different levels of understanding, and it needs to be put under you know, an intersectional framework and a gender equity framework as well, because that underpins everything.
Yeah, thank you. And turning to our Quebec and British Columbia witnesses who are online, if I can ask Ms. Lopez and Porteous, can you add more about the imperative to have a comprehensive approach to gender-sensitive and trauma-informed training for every step of the justice system, and also that uniformity across the country so women who move from place to place can have some assurance of equal access to justice?
We emphasize that the training must have an intersectional perspective, because it's very often that we forget the realities certain marginalized groups face in the context of sexual assault and sexual violence, and these realities are not examined when pushing forward certain initiatives. So when we talk about access to the judicial system, we have to remember that some groups have even faced systemic barriers just to even dévoiler l'agression, in terms of just talking about their experience. It's even more difficult because when you're dealing with groups that don't even have a migratory status that will enable them to access the system, or groups that face racism, systemic racism, or other types of discrimination, accessing the justice system is even more difficult. So I think that this all this initiative has to underline and has to address how all these systemic barriers work against accessing these victims and make it so difficult for them to access the justice system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we go to Sean Fraser for 7 minutes.
Ask Mr. Dias to return to the table quickly. I know we're running up against our time limit. You mentioned, Mr. Dias, during your testimony, the quality of the training that you've been to. I'm a lawyer by trade and have sat through those same sessions, and they can be incredibly weak by times when you show up just to prove that you've done what's mandatory. One of the pieces of testimony we heard from the Commissioner of the Office of Judicial Affairs was that they're seeing a huge uptick in the number of judicial applications to the tune of 500 in this year alone. And he said, point blank, we do not have the capacity to deliver quality training. And what will happen is we will put in some session that satisfies the requirements. Essentially, in my mind, it would be like a rubber stamping process. One of the things that came out of the testimony was there might be another way to do this by saying, let's disclose the training that you have as part of the lengthy questionnaire that we've introduced in the appointments process. Let's have every judge to say, if I'm appointed, I will undertake to complete training, and then on the back end, fund community organizations who are experts to deliver the training. Would this be a better way to protect against the risk that we do a rubber stamping process with people who don't have the lived experience that the experts do?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, I think that would be a great option. I think also the training has to be reoccurring because these issues change dramatically over time. You know, I've been using they, them pronouns for 6 years now, but it was only in the last 2 years that we've seen community organizations, businesses, government recognize non-binary pronouns. So I think the reality is that this education requires a sort of ongoing update and upkeep so that we're staying au courant, certainement. So it's really important that that continues. So yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. And I think having it happen with us first and then moving forward is a brilliant idea.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very good. Unfortunately, in the interests of going to our committee business, that's the end of our panel discussion. So I want to thank all of our witnesses. If there is information you care to send to the clerk afterwards, that would be fine.
Point of order.
Ms. Vecchio, point of order.
I'm just concerned as we're about to go into in camera, and without knowing what the business is, I would like to be able to have the opportunity to know why we're going into the camera. I'm very fearful that the reason we're going into camera is that we have not seen the Prime Minister say that
We've already voted on it.
Actually, there's debate allowed.
Actually, the clerk brought me information that says because we didn't have unanimous consent on the motion to go in camera, that triggers a debate where you will get 3 minutes, each party will get 3 minutes, and then you'll have 1 minute of rebuttal to talk about why it ought to be in camera.
So as I continue, my biggest concern is that we are looking at such a substantial bill that's going to help women and the LGBTQ community, the women who are disabled, First Nations, a variety of different people, and we're very concerned that this government is not in support of this bill, and therefore we are not having the opportunity to hear from the witnesses.
Can we dismiss the witnesses?
No, that
order,
would
Madam Chair. And the clerk may be able to shed some light on this. I believe the correct procedure would have been to have the debate before the vote, and there was an opportunity, and both sides actually commented on it. We did move to a vote and voted to go in camera. Would that not have satisfied the requirements of the debate that seems to be now being relitigated?
The clerk is asked to suspend at this point because she needs to check into that.
Okay,
we'll
thank
suspend.
you.
So we've had a clarification that because apparently the topic of discussion will be the agenda, that's something that's previously already been agreed that we would go in camera for. And so let's
Chair,
suspend.
can I just double check? I thought that the vote was on the point of order, the vote was not to go in camera. That was my understanding.
No, the vote was not on the point of order. The vote was on a motion to go in camera for 15 minutes. But actually, we don't even need a motion to go in camera for things that we've already previously agreed would be. We just didn't know what the topic was. Okay. But now we know that the topic is agenda, and we know that there was a motion that was voted. So we can go in camera.
The room is not being cleared.
Is the room still not cleared?
Are we going in camera?
Oh yes, we're going to go in camera. So let's clear the room, and I'll suspend while we go in camera.
But doesn't